Hi, I'm Hobie Wan. This is Red Chair Reading. We are reading The Ghost of Skeleton Rock by Franklin W. Dixon, Chapter 11, Warehouse Marauders. Frank strained his ears, wondering if he was mistaken. Then he heard it again, a faint scratchy noise which he could not identify. Raising the lid of his box, he beamed a flashlight toward the sound. A large sheet of dirty wrapping paper lay a few yards away. On it crouched a small, brown, furry creature. "What gives?" came a whisper from Joe's box. "Just a rat." The rodent froze for a few seconds in the glare of light, its beady eyes shining with reflected brilliance. Then it scampered off into a dark hole nearby, apparently the opening to a small tunnel for an electrical conduit, but large enough for a person to crawl into. The boys resumed their wait, shifting occasionally to exercise their cramped muscles. The warehouse lay wrapped in gloom, pierced only by a faint glow from the moon through a skylight. Some time later, another noise broke the stillness. It was a faint curse in Spanish. The voice sounded oddly hollow and muffled. Frank and Joe raised the lids of their crates a crack. A moment later, they saw two figures wriggle through the tunnel opening. Both snapped on flashlights and played them around the room. Then the intruders, whose faces were in shadow, separated and began examining the shipping labels on the boxes and crates. One of the men approached the spot where the Hardys were hiding. The boys closed the lids noiselessly and held their breaths. Through a knothole, Joe could make out one man's legs, scarcely inches away. Apparently, he was examining the label on Joe's box. A cold sweat broke out on the youth's forehead. What if he opened the lid? "Hey, come here," called out a raspy voice. "Que quieres?" said the man near Joe. "Think I found something good. A box of fine Swiss watches. Should make a great haul." "Ah, bueno." As the Spanish-speaking intruder moved away, Joe gave a noiseless sigh of relief. The boys could hear muttered conversation as the thieves discussed the loot. Cautiously, Frank and Joe raised the lids of their boxes. A moment later, Chet and Tony lifted theirs. They could see the figures of the two burglars, silhouetted by their own flashlights. They were squatting in front of a small crate, their backs to the boys. One of them seemed to be holding a bag. Scarcely daring to breathe, the four boys watched tensely. One of the men produced a fine saw and began cutting deftly along the label of the box containing the watches. In a few minutes, an opening was made. The thief reached in and removed the packaged watches. Then his partner began filling the box with sand and rubble from the bag to equal its previous weight. "Okay, now," hissed Frank, giving the signal to attack. That would be more like, "Okay." Oh, I kicked the camera. "Okay, now." That was the signal to attack. Moving silently, the four boys started to climb out of their crates. Chet was the first to emerge completely, but in his eagerness, he let the crate's lid slip from his sweaty fingers. Bang! Instantly, the burglars sprang to their feet. "Somebody's here," cried one of them. The other shrilled, "Vámonos! Let's go!" Clicking off their flashlights, the two thieves darted off into the darkness, but the boys snapped on their own lights and managed to pin the fleeing men for a moment in the yellow beams. One of the thieves was heavy-set, dark, and swarthy. The other, slim and blond, bore a startling resemblance to Joe. The Hardys became tense with excitement. Was this the contact man of the gang? The one who had chloroformed Jack Wayne back at the Bayport airfield? "I'll guard the tunnel," Frank told his brother. "The rest of you scatter." The two thieves had already taken cover among the barrels and crates. "One of 'em's over there," shouted Tony, but a crash of boxes indicated that their quarry was already plunging off. Joe, Tony, and Chet lost no time in pursuing him. Soon the darkened warehouse was a scene of bedlam. "I wonder where the watchman is," thought Frank. He must have been knocked out. Crates were banged over. Piles of goods and boxes sent toppling as hunters and quarry blundered about in the darkness. "Help! I've got him!" Chet panted in a far corner of the warehouse. Tony sprinted to aid him. His beam picked out the blond man struggling in Chet's bear-like embrace. Instantly, Tony tackled the fellow around the knees just as he jerked loose from Chet. The stout boy flashed his light square on the prisoner. "It's the one who looks like Joe," Chet cried out triumphantly. "I am Joe," howled the captive. "Oh no!" babbled Chet in nervous confusion. Just then a yell from Frank brought the others whirling to attention. "They're getting away! Come quick!" The three boys raced in the direction of Frank's voice, but it was too late. During the melee between Chet, Joe, and Tony, the two suspects had grabbed Frank and pinned him back behind a stack of barrels. Then they had wriggled through the tunnel. "Come on! Let's go after them!" cried Joe. He started to crawl into the tunnel head first, but Tony dragged him back. "No, Joe, don't try it. Those guys have the advantage." "But we can't let them get away," Joe protested in exasperation. In the meantime, Chet had released Frank, and they ran forward. "Let's try the door," Frank suggested. "Maybe we can nail them in when they come out the other end of the tunnel." He led the way eagerly toward the door. The others hurried after him and tried to push it open. "Locked!" he cried. The boys hurried to a door leading to the office and let themselves outside. Back of a bench, an elderly man was groggily getting to his feet. "You the watchman here?" Frank asked. "See, I think someone knocked me out." "You're right, 2 thieves who've just robbed the place." "We're after them now. Where's the exit to the tunnel?" The dazed watchman led the boys to the marauders' point of exit, an open manhole with its cover overturned. The discovery brought fresh groans. "Of all the rotten brakes," Joe grumbled. Just then Frank heard the sound of a car starting up in the distance. "There they go!" he shouted as twin headlights swept a path through the darkness. Joe glanced around frantically for some way to take up the chase. He spotted a small motorcycle. "Whose is that?" "It is mine, senor," the bewildered watchman admitted. "May I borrow it?" Si, but be careful. Por favor." Joe dashed toward the motorcycle, leaped into the saddle, and kicked the starter. The engine sputtered to life. With a blast of exhaust, he took off after the fleeing car. The noise of the motorcycle gave warning to the thieves that they were being followed. At top speed, they careened through the darkened residential district of Santurce, then into the old town of San Juan. Most of the way, Joe managed to keep the car clearly in view, but after passing San Cristobal Fortress on the right, he emerged into the Plaza Colon to find that the burglar's automobile was no longer in sight. In the center of the square, on a tall pillar, a bronze statue of Christopher Columbus loomed against the night sky. "Oh, brother, if you could only talk," Joe muttered helplessly. Obviously, the thieves had disappeared down one of the narrow cobblestone streets leading off the square, but which one? Wheeling over to a parked taxi, Joe questioned the driver about a speeding car. "Ah, si, senor, it went that way," replied the driver, pointing down one of the streets. "Thanks, muchas gracias," Joe exclaimed, like a gringo. I added the gringo part. So that the warehouse thieves wouldn't hear him approaching, he parked the motorcycle near the entrance to the narrow street and then continued on foot. He had gone scarcely 100 yards when he gasped jubilantly. Ahead in the moonlight stood the thief who resembled Joe. He was putting something into a basket which had been lowered by rope from a balcony. Joe had seen the same method being used earlier that evening when the people purchased fruit or vegetables from street vendors. Sprinting forward, Joe tried to take the man by surprise. Unfortunately, the fellow spotted him and darted into a narrow, twisting street. Quickly, Joe reached up and managed to grab the basket, but the man on the balcony gave it a hard yank, jerking it free. The basket shot up out of Joe's grasp. The young sleuth tried to find an entrance to the building, but apparently there was none facing the street. He retraced his steps part way to the square and found an alley which led back to the houses. Cautiously, he made his way through the shadowy, musty passageway. Counting the buildings, Joe found the one from which the basket had been lowered. It was a 3-story building of pink stucco, with shuttered windows and a wrought iron balcony on each of the 2 upper stories. An outside flight of steps led up to its gloomy-looking interior. Joe started up the steps on tiptoe, but he did not get far. Suddenly, he was struck on the head. Joe slumped to the ground, unconscious. That is the end of chapter 11. Hope you're enjoying the reading as much as I am. Click the button over there for the next chapter. Clicky.